Hi, class. I wanted to now move on into the second lecture of Neo-Freudians. In this class, we're not going to talk about all of the Neo-Freudians, um, not even all of the main ones. We're mainly going to cover Erik Erikson, Alfred Adler, and Carl Jung, and then the Object Relations School, or the British School. We've already talked about Erikson and Jung, and I just recorded and posted a lecture on Alfred Adler for you. So this is the second part of the Neo-Freudians, the many therapists who studied alongside Sigmund Freud and were heavily influenced by Freud, and most of whom split off from Sigmund Freud in some significant way. The bulk of our section today will be on the Object Relations School, and which later became quite synonymous with the so-called British school um, of psychoanalysts who had moved along with Freud to England, and who also in England, um, a new generation of psychoanalysts had been influenced by Sigmund Freud's daughter Anna Freud and several others, and a unique and distinctive school of therapy began to form that was somewhat independent from Freud's school in Vienna. So the Object Relations School is officially an offshoot of psychoanalysis. It goes by the name of the British School just because of so many of its practitioners were trained in psychoanalysis in England. If you'll recall, Sigmund Freud moved his practice from Austria to London at the near the start of World War II, um, because of fears for his safety as a Jewish man, and being in Austria during the time of the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria by National Socialist Germany, where Freud lived the last year of his life, already a very famous man, in London. And then his daughter Anna Freud, who herself was a psychoanalyst and was analyzed by Sigmund Freud, began a long and prosperous practice there, where she in turn influenced many analysts in London. Object relations is considered to be the relational model of psychoanalysis, and it puts a heavy, heavy, heavy emphasis on the quality of relationships, especially early in a person's life. So if Sigmund Freud placed a heavy emphasis on the importance of childhood and childhood experiences in determining later health or pathology, the Object Relations School did this to an extreme degree. Um, Eventually, however, many of the object relations theorists broke off with Freud because they argued that pathology was not necessarily the result from intrapsychic conflict, but from early traumatic relationships. Now, early trauma was nothing new to psychoanalysis. In fact, Sigmund Freud's arguably most brilliant disciple, named Otto Rank, believed that anxiety could be traced in each person to the trauma of childbirth itself, where there was a very violent separation for each one of us in being born. And that separation from a place of warmth and comfort and being more or less on a drip feed of nutrition to having to be in a cold and loud and unfamiliar world registered to us as a very, very early and very significant trauma. And that we spent a substantial portion of our lives trying to overcome this basic trauma that affected us and still was the source of a great deal of anxiety. So the object relations schools looked at early traumatic experiences not quite the same way that Otto Rank did, but they nevertheless focused on the traumatic relationship that would form between a very young child and its primary caregiver, usually the mother. And because that relationship did not always go smoothly, they pointed to lots of moments in the child's life that could be sources of pathology or could go on to become sources of great strength and great resilience. Um, they did not believe that therapy should consist of analysts feeding interpretations to patients during the kind of working through phase of psychoanalysis. Rather, in the context of a therapeutic relationship, something reparative happens, something that kind of restores one's sense of individuality and autonomy and trust, And in order to get to that place, you have to have a secure attachment. You have to be able to securely attach to something first before you can form a distinctive identity all your own. And so, for people who were not yet able to develop a secure attachment to a primary caregiver, this would result in people basically living in a very pathologized way for much of their lives, looking for a secure attachment, but never feeling quite secure enough to enter into a long lasting and rewarding, mutually reciprocal relationship of trust. And so, this was something that could happen to you in early childhood that would go on to affect all of your future relationships if a corrective intervention was not there. And so, object relations later then incorporated some of the work that attachment theorists were doing in research areas, specifically people like Fairbairn, Winnicott, and Melanie Klein, and others. We'll also talk a little bit today about Harry Harlow and his famous study with rhesus monkeys. These are all things that are famous in that branch of the object relations school as they incorporated attachment theory. Object relations has gone through a renaissance in the last 20 years or so. It has become incredibly popular in graduate school circles. Many people who are studying and preparing to become therapists have become re-enamored with the object relations school, or they just sometimes call it the relations school, not even necessarily the object relations school. And a lot of people go on to do further study in this area and would describe themselves in terms of their theoretical orientation as being relational, quote unquote. A couple of the assumptions about the object relations school is that one of the first ones, and probably the most important one, is that each person has an inborn drive to relate to objects. And now, when we say objects, we're not necessarily saying objects in the sense that we usually mean it, like go and pick up the remote control to the television. The remote control is an object. Here, when we say object, we're usually talking about a very, very important perceived representation of an important person in our life. And what's key to this understanding is that the object is not the actual person; it's our perception of who that person is. It comes to be a representative view of reality rather than an actual view of reality. And so that key distinction between perception and reality is an important part of object relations. And what ends up happening is that this view that we take of other people, this view that we have of these objects, becomes internalized, and this is called an introject. Now, if you look at the Freudian defense mechanism of introjection often is when you take someone who's very powerful that you admire and you internalize everything about that person, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, but it's a way of distancing yourself from your own unwanted thoughts or feelings or desires or behaviors. So if you just take something that someone else says to you and you uncritically accept it about yourself, you internalize it, that's a form of introjection. It's where you take something outside of you and you make it a part of your own life. Again, we sometimes do that for better, sometimes we do it for worse, but the design is to protect our ego from our actual thoughts that we have. And so here, though, when we talk about introjects, we're talking about these objects that are usually present from a very early age, and even though they don't have necessarily a strong basis in reality, we nevertheless view them as being the totality of who that person is. So it's an incomplete view of another person that we nevertheless take very seriously. So the classic example would be an infant, and an infant obviously does not have the capacity to develop a sophisticated, fully realized, high-definition view of who the infant's mother is. The view of the mother is a very limited view of the mother. The mother may appear as a face, may appear as brown hair. It may appear as the breast that's available there for for breastfeeding. It may appear as a watch that the person wears that you can feel. You get a tactile sensation of this watch every single time you come into contact with this person. But each one of these limited views of the person is not a complete view of the person. It's like a puzzle piece view of the person. It's very limited. But the point is that it doesn't matter that they have an incomplete view of the person. The view they have of the person is their realistic view of the person as far as they are concerned. And so the key is trying to understand that we sometimes have people who relate to us in ways that don't represent who it is that we really are. And mothers can sometimes speak to this really the strong sense of frustration. For example, if a mother tries again and again and again to be a wonderful mother and provide adequate care and nurture and comfort to the child, and does this every single day very, very consistently without fail. The diapers are always changed, the bottle is always there, or the breast is always there. There's always lots of hugging and cuddling, and the mother is just an incredibly warm, engaging, interactive mom. But on one day, the mother is a few minutes late delivering the bottle, and the baby throws an enormous tantrum. The mother can start to feel the rage and the anger of the baby as the baby acts in anger toward her. The baby has a view of the mother that is very incomplete. The baby views the mother as an object, not as a complete person. The baby has, in a way, dehumanized the mother and can't fully appreciate all of the complexities in her life. Maybe the mother was late getting the bottle because something was wrong with the microwave, and she couldn't get the bottle heated quickly enough and couldn't deliver the bottle quickly enough to the baby, and so the baby's very upset. Well, an adult understands and doesn't get upset in a situation like that. We understand that the microwave could break, but the baby has no concept of this and acts enraged towards the mother, and then the mother starts to act, and this is a key difference. See, the baby is projecting all of this anger and rage onto the mother and imagines that the mother is an evil, cruel person who's withholding love and sustenance toward the baby. And then sometimes the mother will engage in a process called projective identification. Projective identification is different from projection. With projection, you're giving the unwanted feelings and thoughts that you have in yourself towards somebody else to take pressure off of the ego. In projective identification, when someone projects onto you, you start to act like the very person they perceive you to be, even though it may not be true. So in the case of projective identification, the mother would sometimes start to feel guilty, start to feel upset, or start to feel like the baby didn't love her very much. And there would be this weird feeling of not quite anger, but kind of a sour taste in the mouth of the mom, because after all, she's tried so hard. And in a way, it's kind of like she's saying, this is the thanks I get for being a really good mom all this time, is that you're going to scream and yell at me. And it can be kind of a stressful situation. What's important also with this assumption is that our relationship to these introjects, to these internalized objects, are much more important and much more shaping of our lives than the actual people. For example, think of how a child perceives a father. The child has a view of the father that's very, very incomplete. The view that the child has of the father is of who he or she, as the child, sees the father to be for a certain portion of the day, and only while the father is acting in the role of father. But largely, the child is oblivious to all the other aspects of a father's life. For example, the father's history, his own boyhood, his own adolescence, his own educational years, his own young adult years. And then, of course, for the most part, the child doesn't see the father's life outside of the home, if that's where the father's working or spending lots of his time. The child has a limited view of the father, and relates to the part of the father that is in the role of father, but does not relate to the totality of who father is. So it's important in object relations to understand that people respond to their perceptions and their relationship to a certain part of a person, but not to the totality of who that person is. That's a big assumption. Second assumption has to do with how people develop in infancy. The first month, and they're kind of divided into these stages like a lot of psychologists do. They kind of organize people into stages. The first stage is what's called the normal autism stage. Here, autism does not refer um, to the psychiatric disorder, an autistic spectrum disorder, but refers to that stage in very early childhood where a child is largely unaware of the surrounding world and is very egocentric in orientation. So this is there for the first month of life, almost in a literal sense. As I know, for example, that children, their visual acuity does not develop until several weeks after birth, and so like almost in a very literal way, they don't see the world around them that other people who are older see. The second stage, from 2 to 3 months, is symbiosis. This is when the child sees no distinct difference between himself or herself and the mother. As far as the child is concerned, everything that the mother does is part of him or her, and everything that he does is part of the mother. Next is the separation individuation phase, which goes from about 4 months to 3 years. And this is a very, very difficult age, and it includes the potty training years, where the child goes through heightened levels of anxiety as he or she realizes that he is not the mother or she is not the mother, and the child is his or her own person and distinct from other people. And of course, this can be very difficult because the child can sometimes be very fussy and very demanding. The child, for the first several months of life, can largely do whatever he or she wants without any discipline. But the child, maybe at around age 2, can find that the parents are telling the child to do this or don't do this, and the child realizes, wow, I have to actually monitor my behavior and think about what it is that I'm going to do because there are consequences for the way that I behave. So this is a very anxiety-provoking age. It includes the so-called terrible twos, as the child tests limits and pushes limits and stretches boundaries in the effort to try to figure out what in the world is going on here in this relationship. And then after that is object constancy. Notice that this happens over the age of 3 and should not be confused with Jean Piaget's stage of object permanence, although there can be some degree of overlap. In object permanence, this is the stage in child development when a child is able to think about something that no longer appears visually to the child. And so it requires the ability to see things as being permanent. And so there is some degree of overlap, although the terms are not quite the same. And Piaget would have argued that object permanence happens before the age of 3. But object constancy is more referring not to objects that can be hidden from view like you do in cognitive development. But here again, remember, we're talking about objects as internalized representations of people, that people go on being people indefinitely, and that the child, him or herself, goes on being the same person indefinitely. Next assumption is the so-called good object or bad object. This is the tendency that children have to see things in very black and white terms. They tend to see people as being good objects or bad objects. You'll notice that stories that are told to children at this age usually involve the good guy or the bad guy. And as you get older, you may appreciate movies that have a little bit more nuance to them, where the hero of the story might have some undesirable characteristics or maybe highly conflicted. Young children don't understand high conflict. They understand good guys and bad guys, people that are doing good and people that are doing bad. And at very young ages, children don't have the ability to see people who don't give them exactly what they want as being anything but monstrous. And so this idea of a good object, bad object refers to that time in a relationship when a young baby can go from feeling like the mother is a completely perfect good object 1 minute to being a completely awful bad object the next minute, and then maybe as soon as the bottle has been given, the mother goes back to being a completely good object again. So it feels very dehumanizing for the mother, who often refers to herself as being just kind of a machine. I remember one person who jokingly referred to herself, who she had a baby that she was breastfeeding, and she just referred to herself informally as the boob, because the baby didn't see her as being a mother with any kind of complex needs or a personality or an identity of her own. As far as the baby was concerned, the only good thing about the mother was whether or not she was providing a meal for the baby. And so the mother jokingly referred to herself as the boob. That's a classic developmental and object relational kind of language that's used. Um, Learning to see people as being more than just all good or all bad. So moving beyond black and white thinking and being able to see people as being sophisticated or having mixed motives or having conflict inside of them is a crucial developmental goal. And it's one that kids don't always learn. And if it isn't learned, it's thought to affect people in life later on, specifically in the development of symptoms associated with the borderline personality. So the idea here that object relations theorists were trying to get across is that this kind of stuff needs to be learned in childhood. Continuing with this assumption is the idea, and this was proposed by a researcher named Winnicott, is to be a good enough mother. A good enough mother is a concept that refers to the reality that a mother is never going to, during this stage of having a child, the mother is never going to be able to convince the child that she is reliable and trustworthy and faithful and generally speaking, a good person. The mother is going to mess up in the eyes of the baby. And so rather than having this cause guilt or disappointment in the mother, a mother, instead of putting all this pressure on herself to always have to be perfect and to try to convince the child that she's perfect, should instead take things more in stride and accept her limits and accept the things that she can do reasonably well and accept the fact that she's never going to be absolutely perfect in the eyes of her children, and instead adopt a more realistic appraisal of herself called the good enough mother. It's basically a stance or a posture that mothers were encouraged to have that allowed them to be more realistic about their own expectations, learning to trust themselves as being reliable and caregiving and very good people, and to encourage them to be independent and to encourage them to tolerate stress and ambiguity. It's okay to not know everything. It's okay to not have memorized all the parenting books, etc., etc. So mothers that sometimes have dependency needs sometimes find this to be a real struggle because they do sometimes put a huge emphasis on their needing to be perfect mothers, or they demand selfishly that their children always praise them for the great parenting job that they're doing. They want to get that seal of approval from their children or from others that they're great mothers, and disappointment is not tolerated from others in terms of their parenting jobs. And so a lot of moms, too, that struggle with wanting to relinquish the child rearing years and encourage their children to be more independent, they also struggle here as well, because in order to raise a child to maturity, you need to prepare a child to separate and individuate. The fourth assumption is that children have a difficult time seeing people as wholes, WHOLES, and they rather see parts. So we already talked a little bit about this. Melanie Klein was someone who talked a lot about the tendency for young children to see people as being parts and not wholes. And of course, this needs to be very much outgrown. When adults do this, it's a very immature way of looking at people, and it makes other people feel used, because it's almost like you're saying, you only love me because of these two or three attributes that I bring to the relationship, and you don't really love me for the complexity of who I am, the fullness of who I am. You don't love the fullness of my personality. You just like these two or three things about me, and if those things were to disappear, you probably wouldn't like me very much anymore. So it's a way that, if we're not careful, it can seep into adulthood, and it needs to be corrected. Adults who only see the parts of other people tend to use other people, and they tend to have very shallow relationships. The first sign of those parts of people fading or becoming less perfect or becoming less ideal, then the person will really struggle to stay in that relationship. The model of health is that intimacy is by invitation only. So, kind of the point of object relations is to be able to experience intimacy in relationships. And the hope is that people will have been able to develop a secure bond in childhood and to develop secure attachment in childhood so that by the time they get older, they're able to healthfully individuate and separate. And when they're in a relationship, that they can respect the boundaries of another person and let the person that they're with, usually what they mean by this is marriage, is to let that person be themselves and not try to control that other person. So to have freedom of choice in relationships and to be in relationships that are marked by safety, trust, and security. It doesn't mean that those relationships won't have problems, but it does mean that on a basic level, um, you trust the other person to look out for your best interests and to not harm you. The model of abnormality is that basically adults that have not been able to securely attach and have not been able to successfully individuate and separate typically have problems with boundaries. They violate the boundaries of other people. They are too desperate in search for approval, so much so sometimes that they take approval from other people and become and oftentimes behave like adolescents in their adult relationships. So they don't have any respect for other people's boundaries. They don't have a real strong sense of themselves, so they feel empty inside without being in the presence of somebody else. But even when they're in the presence of somebody else, they don't necessarily feel close to that person. It's like the feeling of being alone even though you're in a crowded room. Even though you may be close to someone, you still have not been able to get emotionally close to that person. Adults with this tend to see people as being all good or all bad and not having any complexity. And as I said before, it's often associated with the symptoms of the borderline personality, BPD. The process of therapy and object relations is to balance the fusing with others and individuating. So it's this idea that we can enter into relationships with other people and commit to them and make great sacrifices for the sake of those relationships, even as we retain our individuality and our freedom. Um, when you're doing therapy with a client, a lot is talked about in terms of previous relationships. So what went wrong, what went well. Your relationship with your primary caregiver is talked about. Relationship with parents or guardians is very important, as is the discovery of early traumatic experiences. D.W. Winnicott talked about old traumas need to be revisited and addressed in what he called a holding environment. Holding environment is another term of Winnicott's, where he talked about how in therapy, even though you're not actually touching the client, you can create an atmosphere where the person feels secure and feels held. That's very important. It's a safe, nurturing, intimate, but nevertheless very professional skill that a therapist employs to, or rather, it's a safe, nurturing, and intimate kind of feeling or setting that you create in therapy, but it's very professional and doesn't ever involve inappropriate behavior. There's also a consistent emphasis on termination of treatment and how that will be handled. So, in the first session, the fact that the relationship will be broken off someday is talked about because, of course, this is something that needs to be addressed because it's often a fear that many people who've not developed healthy attachments have, is that eventually there's going to be a parting of ways and it's going to hurt very badly. And the therapist needs to talk about this and normalize this as being an inevitable part of treatment. And if that's done, then the question remains, can we still have a good therapeutic relationship? Can we still invest in each other even though we know there's an expiration date to our treatment? A modern updating of the object relations school. Um, I say a modern update. This really isn't all that modern. This just refers to some of the ways in which the object relations school has been developed into research schools of thought. Probably the most famous one, or one of the most famous one, is the University of Wisconsin's Harry Harlow. Harry Harlow did a very interesting study that involved rhesus monkeys. And here's an interesting question that he asked: if you were to take a bunch of very, very, very young, newborn, or very young rhesus monkeys, and you took them away from their mothers, and then gave them two fake mothers Like one group of the monkeys would be given a fake mother that was made out of wire and steel and nevertheless provided milk. Or do you think, or would they respond best to that kind of a fake mother? Or would they respond to a fake mother that did not provide milk but was made out of soft material that you could cuddle up next to? So the question was, what would the baby monkey prefer? A fake mother in absence of their real mother who provided sustenance and milk, or a fake mother who provided tactile stimulation and comfort? And as it turns out, overwhelmingly, the monkeys preferred the soft, cuddly mother that provided no food, as opposed to the wire, mesh, and steel mother that provided food. And so, what came from that was Harry Harlow's insistence that any good mother provides lots of tactile stimulation, physical contact, lots of cuddling, lots of hugging, and that this is very, very important for mothers to do to children, is to physically touch them. Um, some studies have suggested that um, a child will die if it's not touched in the first few weeks of life, so it's very important. The child will not thrive. Second is the famous studies by Mary Ainsworth and her so-called strange situation studies, where she observed many, many, many hundreds of mothers and their young children and watched them play. And she put them in this situation called the strange situation test, where mothers would be put into a room with their child, and the child would play with toys in that room. And then a stranger would walk in, and then the mother would leave the room, and the child would be alone in the room with the stranger for a few minutes, and then the mother would come back into the room. And Mary Ainsworth wanted to see how children would respond, and she found three responses. She found basically that there was a difference between a securely attached child and an insecure attached child. And this insecure attached child could be broken down further into a response pattern that she called anxious ambivalent and anxious avoidant. So first, let's talk about the securely attached child. The securely attached child would play near the mother and would explore the environment and would branch off away from the mother, but never too far from the mother, and would interact with the world in a very positive way. And when the stranger came into the room, the child would notice the stranger, look to the mother for guidance, and if the mother did not react negatively, would go on playing. When when the mother left the room, the child would get concerned and a little bit worried, not really sure what was going on, and would kind of keep to himself. And when the mother came back into the room, the child would come up to the mother and lavish all sorts of affection onto the mother. So they called that a securely attached child. It was a child that was, relatively speaking, close to the mother, but not dominated by the mother, was not completely held by the mother. The mother let the child interact with the world. The anxious ambivalent child was a child who was never quite sure what to do in the room. Sometimes the child would be close to the mother, sometimes the child would be far away from the mother. When the stranger came into the room, the child did not notice very much, but noticed somewhat. And when the mother left the room, the child became very, very upset. And when the mother came back into the room, the child would often respond by hitting the mother or being inconsolable and not forgiving the mother for having left the room. So they were really touchy and frustrated. And then the anxious avoidant child would usually not respond to the mother. The mother would not respond to the child. They took no notice when the stranger walked into the room. And when the mother left the room, the child took almost no notice whatsoever. And when the mother came back into the room, the child took almost no notice as well. And so that child was thought to be very checked out, and the mother was also very checked out. So this study by Mary Ainsworth, these so-called strange situation studies, strongly validated attentive mothering, mothers that were involved with their children but who did not dominate their children. This led to a whole bunch of publishing of parenting books, Dr. Spock and others who took all of these findings from research and tried to help parents be better parents in terms of raising their children. They advised things like primary caregivers should be balanced, they should be able to tolerate frustrations inside themselves and in their children, they should not spoil their children, that they should not be overindulgent to their children, but they should also be very involved, very tender, very compassionate, very strict, and definitely not an emotional pushover to the child. So there's Harry Harlow at the University of Wisconsin with his rhesus monkeys. And there's Mary Ainsworth, a researcher who was at the University of Virginia who conducted those strange situation studies.